Well, hey everyone, welcome back to the Friday Lunchbox. I'm Tom and this is Ben, and we are going to be walking through God's Word with you each and every Friday at 11 a.m. And so we are going to jump in for this week and look at our reading.
Yeah, so Tom, last week we started our Bible reading. We did Genesis 1 to 15, Mark 1 to 5, and then we had a couple Psalms mixed in as well. Now, you and I talked about this, and we're going to be in the Old and the New Testament throughout this Bible reading plan. And so we don't want to neglect one or the other, but we really felt like as we looked at this week's reading, we would benefit most from spending the majority of our time in the book of Genesis, just because there's a ton of content there. And so why don't you just kind of give us a brief overview of what we read and learned in Genesis?
Yeah, so we're going to spend most of our time here today just looking through Genesis 1 through 11. And the reason for that, right, because Genesis 1 through 3 basically sets up the rest of the Bible. And so we really need to kind of get a grasp of kind of like, okay, what has happened here? What does this look like? And what does it mean? So what really kind of stands out in this like section is kind of there's a cycle that is just like kind of revealed or that we see throughout all of like Scripture, and it's this idea of like if there's like creation, there's fall, there's judgment, and then there's restoration, and it really kind of sets the tone as we look forward even into the New Testament of kind of what God is going to be doing.
Yeah, and in this first section of Genesis, we're going to mainly talk about three big stories that we see where we kind of see this cycle. We'll look at creation and the fall. We'll look at the story of Noah and the ark, and then we're going to finish by just looking real briefly at the Tower of Babel. But we'll see, this cycle just repeats itself one after another. And in a way, we'll see, like you said, this is the story of the whole Bible, and it's in a way a foreshadowing of what's going to happen through what Jesus did on the cross. Yeah,
and so if we get to with Genesis 1 and 2, it's just like creation, like God has made the world. And there's a lot of different things you could look at. I mean, we could dive into each individual thing that he made and kind of look at, okay, what does this mean? What does that mean? But I think to get the overall big picture of, there's a lot of questions we want to maybe ask at times that are kind of like, how long did it take? Like, was it this exact amount of days? Like, what is that day like? And kind of, we really want to look at the meaning here is probably more of a who and why rather than the how.
Yeah, I think that, the creation, the Genesis account is similar to how we might talk about like the book of Revelation, in the sense that there's a lot of people who like to talk a lot about those things, and there's a time and a place for those discussions, and we can learn from those. But the reality is, like you said, we don't want to just know when the world was created or specifically how God did it. Really, what we see in this account is that, and when we read it, we see that God's intent and his design is not necessarily that we would pinpoint, the earth was created in 5086 BC, but rather he's talking about, hey, why did God create the world? What was his purpose in that? And so, again, there's a time and a place for those discussions, and we're not opposed to that, but we'd rather point people to the why and who, right? And just pointing to God's identity as this just all-powerful God who can create things just by speaking, and who's created everything in the universe.
Yeah, and even just kind of like to go from who he is and his ability and power to do that to, hey, he created the world for his glory and to enjoy him. And kind of, again, there's a lot in there, but this idea that like God created everything and everything he made was good, and it was good for his glory. Yeah. But then we get to man, and that's a special thing that he made. Everything else was good. It was very good.
Yeah, we see just how distinct the creation account is when it comes to him creating Adam and Eve, right? Everything else he speaks into existence. When he makes Adam and Eve, he forms them with his hands. He breathes his breath of life into them, right? And probably most famously, right, we see that God made man in his own image. Now, that's kind of we've probably all heard that phrase before, but just let's spend a little time talking about like what does that even mean to be created in the image of God? Does that mean that we look exactly like God? Does that mean something different? I mean, have you thought about that before, or what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, as a kid, like growing up in church, you'd hear I was made in the image of God, and like, okay, I guess God made me to look exactly like Him in a physical sense, but really, I don't think that's the key. And I think there's a lot of kind of that we maybe don't know what exactly that entails, but it does point us to there's a special like relationship that God has with man and woman as His pride of His like creation that doesn't happen with, say, a dolphin or something like that. Like there's like the breath of God in us, like the breath of life, is a like distinct thing for just us, and in His image, I think it goes along with that.
Yeah, and I mean, I think there's different theories about it. Some people, and I think you could even say, Jesus was a man, and so in a way we're in that same sort of image. Other people would say, well, it's our conscience. That's what sets us apart from the rest of creation. Or people say, well, it's because we have a spirit that lives forever and animals don't have that. There's all sorts of theories, but you're right. The main idea, I think, that it really points to is that we are unique in God's creation, and that He desires to have this different kind of relationship with us than He does with anything else in creation. Even the angels, we have a very unique place. And that's an awesome thing to consider, that God made us and He made us unique and special to know Him and have that relationship with Him.
Yeah, which God like creates everything, He like creates man, then He rests, and then but the perfect life that is so brief in like God's word, we see that man walked with God and had that communion and that relationship with God. Like there's no account of God walking with a porcupine and talking about things or anything like that. Like it is a unique thing to be a like human and with your creator. And so I think it is definitely that special thing, but it also is what makes the fall, right? That next step so hard and so
so devastating, right? That God did create this perfect world, and He had this perfect relationship with man and woman, and things were great. And we all know this story. There's one tree that they're not supposed to eat from, and we don't know how long it takes. We know in the Bible narrative it's not very many verses where we see Adam and Eve approach that tree. They're deceived by the serpent, by Satan. Eve eats, Adam eats, and we see that they, for the first time, realize that they're naked and they feel shame. And so this is kind of a weird story. I think if we grew up in church, we know it, and it's just kind of, well, that's the story. But again, if you're new to the Bible or you've never read it before, this is kind of a strange story, right? One, there's a snake who's talking and deceiving the human beings, but two, like, what's the big deal with this tree? Like, why is there this one tree that they can't eat from? Right. And so what would you say to somebody who has some of those kind of questions?
Yeah, I think it's kind of like we almost have this view in our mind of like there's certain things that are really bad things to do. So why did God basically make eating fruit the thing that did it, right? That a murder or something could have seemed like, okay, that was a big harsh thing. That's why. But there's a lot that goes into it. But I think there's a lot of that just that God want to know: does my creation trust me? Right? Are they going to follow me even when they may not know and understand? Are they just going to rely and trust because it's my word and what I said? And which the tragic thing is I think that they started out that way, and I think they wanted to do it, but then they start to listen to those outside opinions and voices, and like it's not a like, okay, there's one thing I said. It's slowly moved in that direction, and I think it's a picture of our lives too. Of like we don't like sin because we necessarily I want to do the worst possible thing, but I think it's a slow fade to that. Is it really that bad? Is it really? Well, it's not, and you kind of just slowly move there.
Yeah, and I think. Again, we would never openly say, well, I know that this is what God wants, and I'm going to defiantly disobey Him and say that I don't believe that He's right, and I'm going to do what I want. But when you really boil it down, and when you think about this story, right, that's what Adam and Eve did, and that's what we do every day, right? We, for whatever reason, begin to believe that we know better than God does. And again, it's not about the tree, it's about... what we see happen is that Adam and Eve just again, deceived by Satan, but they begin to believe that they know better than God, and that, well, God said we shouldn't eat this, but it looks good, and I think maybe it's okay to eat it, right? And so I think it's more, less about the actual tree and just more about what it reveals in Adam and Eve and even us today. And we know that sin from Adam and Eve had some pretty severe consequences for them, right? We see that they're cast out of the garden, but we also know that it even has implications for us today, right? That's the Bible teaches that. It teaches about what we would call original sin, right? Not a topic that we talk about very often, but it's just this idea that because of Adam's sin, now all of humanity is born with this internal, innate sin nature that rebels against God, which is kind of crazy to think about, but that's what we see in the Bible.
Yeah. I think that we can kind of get that. Well, is that fair? Is it not? And that's an argument to really not be had, to quite honestly, because I think we can look at our own lives and know there is evidence of that in me. Like, whether I deserve it or not, like whether I think that doesn't matter. It is there. I look at my kids and they're sweet and they're young, but it's like they can do some sinful things.
You don't have to teach a kid how to be selfish or to bite you when they're angry. They just it's built in us. You have that conversation with people who, there's that big question that always gets asked, like, well, are people basically good or people basically bad? And I always think, well, like, obviously I think the Bible teaches people are basically bad and sinful, and I think there's maybe no better evidence of that than a toddler. There are some things that my kids do where I say, I know that I've never done anything like that in front of them.
Right in front of them,
not in front of them. How did they come up with that? How could they do that? And it's just because we have this innately selfish, sinful nature. And we see, again, the effects of Adam and Eve and their sin playing out even today in our own lives.
Right. Yeah. And again, it's like there's the pride that you see there of like, maybe God doesn't know what's best for me. Just thinking that they, as His like creation, know that, and we see that in our lives, and we see that as we like carry through. Like the issue that is always the thing at the forefront is I'm thinking that I know what God says, but I think that I maybe know better, and I think that kind of leads to, okay, man, there's a problem here, and so we get to there's judgment that happens on that.
Yeah, and it's one of the things I think that I know I've overlooked that often goes overlooked in this story, right? As we do see God's perfect creation, we see the fall, we see His judgment casting them out of the garden. He tells them that they're going to die one day, they're going to have struggles. But we also see God's restoration even in the creation story. One, we see in Genesis 3 how He talks about how one of Eve's descendants is going to crush the head of the serpent,
right.
and we believe that's again a foreshadow of what Jesus is going to do one day on the cross. But even beyond that, we also see this verse that's kind of buried in there that talks about how God covers Adam and Eve with skins, right? And He's talking about animal skins, and which begs the question, well, why is He doing that? What is that all about? And again, this isn't explicit in the Bible, but we're kind of, reading into what that means. And I think it's pretty safe to assume it means that God killed an animal, He sacrificed an animal, and used the skins of the animal to cover Adam and Eve's sin or their shame, right? It's this, again, picture of Him restoring them by making a sacrifice and covering them with the animal skins. And so it's cool how, again, you see creation, fall, judgment, but there's this picture of restoration even within this story right after the fall.
Yeah, which even as we get into like just like Leviticus and sacrificial stuff, like it all kind of starts here of like God Himself has said, hey, there's a problem, and in order for there to be a restoration, something must pay the price. And so I think that again, it does point forward to that. And of course, they are kicked out of the garden, and then but then we kind of move into like this cycle kind of like continues, right? Like you would think they learned their lesson. Like there's two of them. Like, okay, we screwed this up. It was a problem. But they don't, right? And then we get into the flood and Noah.
Yeah, I mean, we see a couple of stories before the flood, but the flood's the next big one. And and I just want to read from Genesis 6, 5 through 8, because it kind of just paints a picture of what the world was like back then and what were the events leading up to the flood. And so Genesis 6, starting in verse 5, it says this: When the Lord saw that human wickedness was widespread on the earth, and that every inclination of the human mind was nothing but evil all the time, the Lord regretted that he had made man on the earth, and he was deeply grieved. Then the Lord said, I will wipe mankind whom I created off the face of the earth, together with the animals, creatures that crawl, and birds of the sky, for I regret that I made them. Noah, however, found favor with the Lord. And, again, if you read that closely, you read words like every inclination of their heart, right? Nothing was on their mind but evil all the time, continually, right? These really, it seems like, the writer of Genesis is trying to be really clear. Things were really bad. Sin was everywhere. Evil was everywhere. And that's what leads up to the flood, right? Which is not a sparkly, fun story to talk about, but that's the reality that was on the earth, and that's what led to God making this decision.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, there's a harshness to the sound of like evil, like continually, like we do some good things, right? Like there's some good things in there, but not like it's a picture of just complete, like utter. We're gone from God. Like we just have turned our back completely on Him. And then there's the result that almost is like it's that other foot like dropping of like, and in verse 6 it says, and the Lord like regretted that he had made man on earth. And that's kind of one that I think it's hard to wrestle with, because you get that, did God like regret? Did he make a mistake? Like what does that mean there? Right?
Yeah, no, it's tough. And maybe somebody a lot smarter than me could have a really good answer for that. But it is difficult. We believe that God's perfect. We believe that he doesn't make mistakes. And so how can he regret something if he doesn't make mistakes? And, we were talking about it. I thought you had a good example just about like the wedding dress in the mud. If you want to share that.
Yeah. And it's not a perfect analogy,
right,
but
sure,
it's
course.
one of those that like God has given his pride of his creation, right? Man, he's given us this amazing gift of life and communion with him. And it's like, hey, giving someone a wedding dress, it's beautiful. It's as close to perfect as you can be. And then rather than using that for the intended purpose of walking down the aisle for that wedding, it's I'm going to go play in a mud puddle. And it's just kind of a picture of like someone who is given something of such precious value, and then they look and see it's being used in a way that's like completely not what it was intended for. And it's I didn't want to take that gift back. Not that I wish I had, but why did that happen? Just that there's a sorrow there, right? That God is saddened by our sin.
Right. It even says, right, that not only did he grieve, but not only that did he regret, but he was deeply grieved. And I think that's kind of alluding to what you just said, that, again, sometimes I think the Bible uses language so that we can understand how God might feel, even though God isn't like us and doesn't have, he doesn't have the exact same emotions as we do, but I think it's more talking about just that grief and that sorrow that he has. He sees how far mankind has fallen. He remembers clearly his time in the garden with Adam and Eve, walking with them and having that perfect relationship. And now he sees just total depravity, total brokenness, and that makes him upset. It grieves him. It sorrows him. And, it's just, I think about it too, with our kids, our kids make mistakes, and when our kids make mistakes, we regret that they make those mistakes. We obviously don't regret that they're our children or that they're alive, but we regret what has happened in their life, and we regret the decisions that they've made, even because they hurt us and they cause us grief. And so I think it's a similar thing that we see here in the book of Genesis with the story of Noah. But then, of course, we get into the actual story of Noah and the flood, and we see very clearly a picture of God's judgment, right? That because God's holy and because he's perfect, and because sin is an offense against him, he brings judgment on the earth through the flood.
Yeah, which again, this is not the story that we necessarily talk about with our kids. And then everybody died in a flood, right?
I think
we kind of focus on the after part, but in order to see the beauty of the after, you have to see there was the God's like creation fell, there was a problem, and judgment comes after that, and that life cycle continues. And God, even in that though, there's the picture of the restoration of like, hey, because Noah was not a perfect guy, and I mean, we'll continue our reading and say, man, this guy had some pretty messed up flaws in his life, but God chose to be gracious, right? God chose to be like merciful and still judge, and that we see that, hey, he's going to wipe out the earth, but he's going to give a fresh start.
Yeah, and I would say again, I'll be honest. This is again a hard story. I was thinking when you were just talking about it, when you talk to a kid about Noah and the flood, they think, oh yeah, Noah and the ark. He's got all the animals on there with
bird
him.
Comes,
it's so cool. It's such a cool story, but they don't maybe realize what else is happening in that story. That everyone outside of the ark is being wiped out in judgment, and how severe that is. That's hard to wrap our heads around. But, I think that if we're struggling with God's judgment, it's not because God's judgment is too harsh or because it's too big. It's because our view of God is too small. We underestimate how serious our sin is, and we underestimate how holy and perfect He is. And so just like in the garden, well, they just ate from a tree. Why is that such a big deal? It's because God is perfect and holy, and our sin is an offense against Him. And so we see again this cycle of God giving them life, but then them falling into sin, and then His judgment coming. But like you said, there's restoration for Noah, for his family, and for the animals that are on the ark with them.
Yeah. And then you kind of like, even as they leave the ark, like there's the promise that God gives of like the rainbow, that I'm never going to flood the earth again. But like God also knew, hey, man's going to go back to sinning. Yeah. Man's going to keep like doing this. And so as a promise of, hey, just looking forward to that like Messiah, like, man, there is another way that things are going to be fixed.
Yeah, and we see it doesn't take long for them to fall back into that same cycle. Noah himself, right after they get off of the ark, and it says he's a man of the field, and he's a farmer, and he plants, and he gets drunk with wine, and something weird happens with one of his sons. We're not going to even dive into that, but we just know, right, it's pretty quick that sin takes over again. God promises, He makes the covenant with him. He echoes kind of the same thing He told Adam in Genesis, right? He tells Noah and his family to be fruitful, to multiply, and to fill the earth, right? And then we get to this story, right, the Tower of Babel in Genesis chapter 11, where, it's kind of disorienting, especially if you're not familiar with the Bible. You read this story and you're like, well, what's the big deal? Why is God upset with the people for coming together and building a tower? So again, how would you respond to somebody who's just kind of struggling with that, trying to understand why this is such a big deal?
Yeah, because at first glance, you look at, okay, the people of the earth are working like together in peace, in harmony.
Yeah, it seems like a good
and they're striving together for a common goal. Like, oh, why is that not the ideal? But really, they're doing the exact opposite of what God had wanted. Be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth. And they're saying, hey, let's all stay here. Let's build this to ourselves. Right? You see over and over again in that the passage that and they built this for themselves. They did this and it's self-focused, and it's this idea that they're not doing things for God and for His like glory. They're doing it for the glory of themselves. And
in Genesis 11, verse 4, this is the people building the Tower of Babel. They say, come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the sky. Let us make a name for ourselves. Otherwise, we'll be scattered throughout the earth. And like you said, I think it's nothing wrong with teamwork or coming together, but it's the fact that they're literally going directly against what God told Adam in the beginning, and what He just has told Noah in chapter 9 to be fruitful, to multiply, and spread out, and to fill the earth. And now they're doing the exact opposite. And again, it's a picture of the pride of man. Let us make a name for ourselves, right? They're puffing themselves up, right? Trying to make themselves look big rather than glorifying God who created everything. Yeah,
you look back to just account of like creation, and like it's eerily like similar, like the language that they're like using to what God is talking about in Himself. Like, let us make man in our image. Like, and it's kind of that like we have placed ourselves as God. Let us do this because we are God of our life. Yeah. And it is that pride that is the that is the problem. That is the sin. That's the thing that leads to, okay, there's judgment that needs to happen here, because sin is just a continual problem that needs to be addressed.
Yeah, and so we see God confuses their language. He scatters them, right? And the idea here is not that God's limiting their power, but instead he's just trying to ensure that his original plan and design are being carried out like he created the world to function. And so we read a little bit about Abraham this week. We're going to save that for our discussion next week because we'll have some more time to talk about his story. But that's kind of a good kind of stopping point for the book of Genesis this week. Yeah,
of course, we did some in Mark chapters 1 through 5, and it's kind of a nice change of pace a little bit, because we talk about, hey, God that created everything, and it went downhill real quick. And then we look at the like Gospel of Mark, and it's already God has sent his son. Like, there's a Messiah that's coming, and we look at God's plan to put things right once and for all as we look at those. And there's death and judgment, right? But there's also, hey, life is coming because Jesus is coming.
Well, we covered a lot today. We're excited to continue on with you next week. But before we go, we do have one good minute for you with one of our very own First Baptist Church of Arnold staff members.
Hi, I'm Jeff Russom, Children's Pastor at First Baptist Church of Arnold. Probably the Colorado Rocky Mountains. NCIS. I can't think of anything strange. It's just normal stuff. I whistle the theme to Good, Bad, and the Ugly quite a bit. Probably a remote control car has a Cardinals. To be able to sing and play guitar. It's not the Fugitive, it's the one U.S. Marshals. Peanut butter and jelly. Riding around town. Yes. My name is Jeff, and I like to party.
Well, it's awesome to learn about Jeff. One thing he did not say in there, he does an Elvis impersonation.
Interesting. So, any good?
He does it. So, yeah. I mean, it's not bad.
Well, glad we could hear from Jeff, and we hope we can hear from you this week. A lot of ways you can interact with us. You can leave a comment below, or text us or email us if you have questions about anything we covered this week or something that you're just curious about. Or, if you want to know about Jeff's Elvis impression or just what he likes to do on Friday night, we would love to hear from you and get back with you as we continue on this journey together. So next week's reading, we're going to be in Genesis chapter 16 through 27, Mark 6 through 10, and then again, a few more Psalms, Psalm 19, 104, and 148. So join us if you haven't yet. We'd love to do this with you, and we're excited for the weeks ahead.
Well, that is all we have for you this week. Thanks again for joining us on the Friday Lunchbox. We cannot wait to get back with you again next Friday. See you soon.